going to try and introduce the title because it has a lovely, intriguing sound to it. It says, A Night Journey to the Final Eureka. It's kind of a talk title that's nearly worthy of the great Moriarty himself, isn't it? Anyway, the small print beneath it says, Science meets mysticism on humankind's ultimate discovery as envisioned by John Moriarty. Sounds like an interesting trip. So it remains for me just to introduce Mc Darby here. He's been with us for the other talks as well. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read this introduction because there's a couple of very technical terms in it, let's say. Gary's background is in science, so you'll understand when I read this. He is a Chief Technical Officer of what's called Fifth Province Ventures, a company that is developing Wispel, a new social networking platform that actually encourages people to meet in real life. How about that for novelty? He has a background in electronic engineering and neuroscience and was awarded an MIT-endorsed PhD in biomedical engineering. He spent 4 years as principal investigator leading to the Mind Games group in MIT Media Lab Europe, focusing on technology and neuroscience, which is where he first met John Moriarty. He was privileged to have spent a lot of time with John in his last few years, and the talk tonight is based on some of the many conversations and reflections that he had with John during what he refers to as those precious times. So without further ado, I leave you in the very capable hands of Mc Darby.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks a million for coming along. Guys always thanked John Joe at the end of their talks. I'm going to do it at the start just to say thanks a million for inviting me to do this. And it's a great privilege. It's a great privilege to give a talk about a friend. It's also a very hard talk to do. It's probably, I was saying to some of the guys earlier on, it's probably the hardest talk I've ever put together. And I've given a lot of talks in my life. So I might get it wrong and I might go adrift on a few things. There's a lot in it. But it is a journey, and I hope you'll join me on the journey. So I'm going to just dim the lights. There's a little bit of audio visual in some of this. So I thought we would begin with some words from the man himself.
This is John Moriarty. Thank you, Brian. So I was looking out to the east, out of my bedroom window, just as I was getting up around 7 o'clock, and there were long bands of mist all over Slievin to East Kerry. And for the first time in my life, I had to look away because it was much more than beautiful. It was tremendous. When people ask me, are you happy? I'd say, that isn't quite the question. The real question is, am I still growing? Have I become a finished creation? Am I dead? Or am I still growing? And is my life still an adventure? An adventure full of trouble, full of joy, full of pain, full of cataclysm. Am I still living dangerously? And so, am I still growing is the real question. I'm a man of faith, like that. I have a kind of Christian faith that our death is the end of the story, and my life in the universe is the whole story. And so the healing is finally embracing the illness. Death is a door to somewhere else, like. I got a great run of life, like I'm 68 years of age, like, and if I was told, say 30 years ago, 20 years ago, that time, like, I'd have been very, very sad indeed, because I'd have felt there was an awful lot more stuff in my life got out of me. But at this stage, like, I got a great run, 68 years more or less straight run, and like, a lot of stuff that I needed to say and get out of me, I have said. I would never fear myself, like, terminally ill, because, like, it's a departure lounge, not a terminal lounge, like, it's life goes on. I'm absolutely sure of one thing, like, I see myself as just going on, and I'll be different in a different place, like, and I can only say that like, I do believe, like, that there is a hereafter. Can I just read one stanza to you? It was written by Dylan Thomas at the age of 16, and it's called And Death Should Have No Dominion. millennium. Dead men naked, they should be one with the man in the wind and the west moon, when their bones have been clean and the clean bones gone. They should have stars that elbow and fruit. Though they go mad, they shall be saved. Though they sink through the sea, they shall rise again. Though lovers be lost, love shall not, and death shall have no dominion. And that wonderful line, and they shall have stars at elbow and foot. And there are people lying in the flat in the back and said, Luke's hospital today, or another hospital, you know. I want to say to them, God bless us all. Like who we are from conception to death isn't the whole story. Our life in the universe isn't the whole story, and the universe itself isn't the whole story. And a day will come, I know it, Joe, a day will come when we all of us will have stars at elbow and foot.
So I was wondering how I'd react first. John Joe, you might just drop this. I don't think I need to be this loud. This is the part of the volume. You can probably all hear me anyway, can you? Yeah, I think we might, because there's a bit of music early on, we don't as well. So I'll speak up. I was wondering, I get quite emotional at that, because this is a friend, and the beautiful sensitivity of the man resonated with me every time I met him. So one of the things I'm going to do is, this isn't about me obviously, this is about John, but I thought I would mirror part of my own story, my own journey, and where it was going as a scientist, I suppose, and then meeting with John and how that all changed. And so there is a little bit about me at the start of this, but it's to try and illustrate, if I was to represent where science is or where we're going, I'm kind of the ambassador for that. And it was really the meeting with John that changed my perspective anyway. I want to get that across. Just before I do that, the last year of John's life, 2007, was a time when he published The Night Journey to a Guidebook. And I spent a lot of time with him then, and as many of you know, that's probably his most difficult book. It's really, really difficult to get into. And so a lot of the talk is actually based on Night Journey to a Guidebook, not because I'm an expert in it, because it's the only one I actually know anything really about, because I have to talk to him about it. But also, when the book was launched, Aidan Matthews gave a beautiful metaphor for John. And this here is Brennanstown, Dolman. And it's just next to the M50. Here's the M50 here. It's in Cabinteely. It's kind of set in the middle of all that's familiar to us, I suppose. And John was with Aidan one day, and a mare in a foal, or first of all, a foaling mare, was just around the dolmen and attacked Aidan and John as they were visiting the dolmen. And John was able to pick up a branch and ward off the mare. And Aidan basically describes that beautifully. He says that that's the way John is. He can take us to very dangerous places, but he can guide us there, and he can also protect us. And I think that's a wonderful metaphor for John, because if you read through some of his things, he goes into the darker side of much of the things we've written, but he guides us and protects us at the same time. And I think that's a wonderful way of looking at what John does, because a lot of times we don't go near some of the things he talks about because we're scared, actually. So this is me in the early 90s, for no good reason except being in my 20s and being foolhardy. I ended up in Liberia, and of those of you that know me, this is not boasting. I would never do this again. It was boiling mad and crazy. But I ended up working with child soldiers. And up to that point, I had kind of two Christian maxims that sort of guided my life. One was, give to the least of your brothers and sisters, because I just thought that's a great thing to do. It's a great way to live your life. And the children are the closest to the kingdom of God. They were the two kind of anchor stones in my kind of Christian upbringing at the time. And in kind of one fell swoop, I worked with child soldiers for a couple of weeks. And I met a young boy who was 12, his name was Prince. And he basically was going mad, he was going crazy. And I had a piece of technology with me at the time, it was the old Walkman. And I had a tape of Enya's music on it. And he wasn't able to go to sleep. And because he wasn't able to go to sleep, he was going crazier and crazier. And it occurred to me that if I gave him this Walkman, it calm him down. And amazingly, the music calmed him down. I'm going to play a piece of music now just in a second. But it was a huge insight into me at the time that technology can play a very positive role in humanity. Here was something technology could do that a human being couldn't. There was no human intervention that was going to help this young child, but the technology did help them to relax. And that began the whole journey at the time. What I didn't appreciate at the time, so many years later, is that I fell into my own story at the time. Being able to sort of be around kids and the complete lack of compassion and all the things I kind of really believed in humanity fell away. I didn't know that, but it created a kind of a darkness in it. Here's the music, just so that it's not all dark. You can remember this. It's a beautiful piece of music, and it was this piece of music that helped that young child relax. But point being, something dramatic changed for me at that particular time. John often talks about falling out of his story, and I am sure there are other parts in his life that didn't help, but certainly reading The Origin of the Species didn't help. And as a scientist, I don't know of any book that's had a greater impact on our spiritual selves was The Origin of the Species. It had a dramatic, profound impact on humanity when it was published. And in many ways I can understand why he was concerned. So who was Charles Robert Darwin? He was a naturalist. And he published a book in 1859, and pretty much he said that all life is connected and evolved from primitive life forms. A lot of people talk about the survival of the fittest, but it's actually all life is connected and evolved from primitive life forms. That's the most profound discovery. And that random mutations produce new species with only the fittest surviving, which is pretty much saying we live in a random universe. And to anybody that believes in anything other than randomness, that's a huge statement to make. His discovery happened while he was going around on the Beagle. The voyage of the Beagle, it's often called. He was documenting this particular voyage. It was a circumnavigation of the world. It was supposed to last 2 years. It lasted 5. And 3 years and 8 months he spent on land making discoveries. And it was the Galapagos Islands that really happened for him. And the reason the Galapagos were important was because they're not part of what's called a plate tectonic shift. So at one stage in history we were all one continent, and there was bridges and ways for one continent to get to the other, and so there was a lot of mixing and mingling of species and so on. But on the Galapagos there wasn't. They evolved by themselves. And so you had a very pure evolutionary mechanism to study and look at. And that's what gave him the insight. From here to the Darwin finches and so on. He was able to look at specific features of animals and say they evolved for particular reasons. And that was what his great insight came from. It used to be called the Enchanted Isles. It was renamed the Galapagos. And I remember saying to John one day, you saying to me, he said, when they renamed it, the magic was lost. Which was a brilliant metaphor. It's a very interesting set of islands because Melville, Moby Dick, he spent some time on the Enchanted Islands, as we'll call them. And he found them an awful place. I'll just quote some of the things he wrote about them. He said, it is deemed a fit type of all forsaken, overthrown, that the jackal should den in the wastes of weedy Babylon, but the encantos refuse to harbour even the outcasts of the beasts. Man and wolf alike disown them. Little but reptile life is found here, tortoises, lizards, immense spiders, snakes, and that strangest anomaly of outlandish nature, the iguana. No voice, no low, no howl is heard. The chief sound of life here is a hiss. The islands were used by whalers at the time, when the whale industry was booming before we discovered oil. And he was on the whaling boat, and that's what inspired Moby Dick, a book which was very, very important to John. But just think of this, when the whaling industry died because we found oil, think of what we were doing before we found oil. we were raping the seas for these huge, beautiful creatures to take the oil out of their brains to fuel our world. And that deeply disturbed Melvin at the time, and it obviously deeply disturbed John. It's just interesting that we discovered oil and that killed the whaling industry, but what else have we done with it since? And this is the scary thing of evolution. And if you haven't seen this before, it's called the Tree of Life. And up one top corner here is microbial life, and down here is us. And that tree is pretty much filled now in terms of knowledge, and particularly because of DNA analysis, is that we know that we've evolved and all the evidence is there. And we started out here and we've ended up here. And to a scientist, the 10,000 years of scripture, which is how Genesis and beyond describes the world, that describes 10,000 years, pretty much the time we became self-aware. But it ignores the other 3.5 billion years of life on the planet, and the other 13 billion years or so in the origin of the universe. And that's where the great divide is. And I think that's where the schism happened for John. That's there, so how do you explain that? How do you explain all that prehistory before we became conscious, before we became aware? Back to me. So, on my journey, as I was shifting into darkness, I decided I'd read Faust, not the lightest material. And I actually came to it in a strange way. I came to the music of Gustav Mahler. He saw, in the Goethe's version of Faust, he saw redemption in our longing and in our exploring and in our sort of constant wanting to know and being curious. But anyway, I read this book and it had a profound impact on me. And what I decided to do was, well, in the absence of God, what could I do to live a life of meaning? And I decided I would just devote myself to looking at technologies and uses of technologies that might improve or expand human potential. Around Faust itself, John wrote this poem. I won't touch this because I'm sure Moya is going to do something this next week, but just the reason I mention it is that John, we had a discussion with Faust at one stage, and he said that when he was in his 20s, he took on a Faustian role. He fell out of the story and he went for it. He went and did all kinds of shady things, I suspect, and went out to the fringes, and eventually came back on a long road back to Christianity. But he did go out there to the fringes. Somebody described it last week that he went down the steps of hell and back up the steps of heaven further than most people. But something along those lines, he did take on kind of a Faustian role when he was younger. So to give you an example of some of the technologies that I was interested in, I was looking at, I read this book called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, which was read by a guy called John Moriarty. And John Dominique had a massive stroke and went into what's I think called locked in. It's about as far as you can get in terms of being alive and not being able to engage with the world. So your whole sensory system, you can feel the world, but you can't react to it. Your whole motor system is dead. But his brain replasticized and he was able to blink, and he blinked out the book, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. It's a beautiful metaphor, him being the butterfly and the bell, but he couldn't make any sound. And many years later, this had a big impact, many years later, I decided I would try and build something that would allow you write that book without any human intervention, because the human intervention was he'd present letters to him and he'd pick the letters by blinking that column, that row, whatever it might be. And many years later we built this as kind of an example of how technology could be used constructively, thinking of the most possibly isolated people in the world and how the technology could play a role. I'll come back to that later on. While I was in that lab, this was the media lab, which John Joe mentioned, Ken Haas, the director at the time, said to me, find me somebody in Ireland who would be against technology and make him a keynote speaker at one of our open houses, one of our seminars. And through jigs and reels and through wonderful Mary, I met John in Mary's pub. I think it was around 2002, 2003. And in the space of half an hour my life changed completely. We also decided what the theme of the talk would be. We called it Prometheus and the Dolphin. And John and I became friends. And I don't know whether we've all experienced it, I suppose we all do, but you meet somebody and you know life is now different, I'm on a different path. That's the way it was with John. And we stayed friends over those years. I'd often bring people down to his house in Mangerton and just sit there and talk for hours with anything, because he could talk about anything. But anyway, that was the meeting with John, and so it changed things, and he challenged me. He said, look, we've gone the wrong way, and we've gone what's called the Promethean way. The Promethean way being we've stolen fire from heaven, and we're using it to shape the earth. We're controlling the universe about us, or we want to shape the universe to suit ourselves. Whereas the dolphin, with its beautiful backbone, has allowed the universe shape it, and who has gone the right way, and he challenged me deeply on that. So this next bit is a bit of visual. We're going to go back to that time, that Promethean time, when it all changed, right? And it's an articulation by Stanley Kubrick in 2001. So just a couple of minutes. I have to be very careful with the sound here, because there's a big roaring bit, so just a minute. So there's for the whole day talking frame by frame. That's that slide. That's Stanley Kubrick's version of Arthur C. Clarke's 2001. And a couple of things about it were that there was a moment somewhere in our history, a couple of million years ago, when we decided to use tools to shape the universe about us. We were originally herbivores. You notice the relationship with the animals before the moment was kind of symbiotic, I suppose, and then afterwards we ate them. And then you also notice that hierarchies develop. You know, the people who most get to the top, the people who don't are scrabbling at the bottom or fighting, and so on. Does anyone recognise the music at all? It's a very famous piece of music. It was written by a guy called Richard Strauss, who was an Austrian-German composer, and he wrote it as a tribute to Nietzsche's, probably his most famous book, the one that most people would know anyway, would be Also sprach Zarathustra. So it's actually the tone poem for Also sprach Zarathustra. And the reason Kubrick used that at the time was to emphasise that the will to power went with that shaping the universe. So the will to power, the will to be the Superman, the one to dominate the species and so on, went with the shaping of the planet. And we all know what happened to the Nietzschean philosophy. I mean, Richard Wagner, Hitler's most favourite composer, was a good friend of Richard Strauss. And that whole philosophy around rise to the top because you can was ultimately the basis of fascism and Nazism. And although it's misinterpreted, it was uttering those stark words that God is dead and our future is in our own hands, or the will of the Superman, essentially. We saw how it manifested itself. So a lot of people attribute till God is dead, or I stare into the abyss and the abyss stares back, or what that nonsense, what doesn't hurt me makes me stronger. I don't know how that one crept through, but anyway. They attribute it as the most famous quotes, but John focused on this as the most important thing that Nietzsche discovered, I think. And he says this: I've discovered for myself that the old human and animal life, indeed the entire prehistory and past of all sentient being, works on, loves on, hates on, thinks on me. Now there's an addendum to it where he struggles with that. We'll get back to that later on. But basically, the discovery that we're animals, and that the genes that this is, around the time when the origin of species had been published and whatnot, there was an incredible wondering about who we are and what we are. We're animals, is what Nietzsche was saying, and we're built in the same genetics that the tyrannosaur and all these awful creatures in the past were built, and our genes have come from that. So there's an animal part to us, and we're not comfortable with that. So if we look at the stages of human evolution, 10 million years where we were conscious, or we've been conscious, the 10,000 years of conscious, is down around there. We think it's around there. Self-conscious being some sense of self-awareness, some sense of we exist, or we are, essentially. And then we look at the other stages where the use of tools was about 2 to 3 million years ago. Taming a fire, possibly the ultimate Promethean moment, was about 1 million years later. And then strangely, predating that was cave painting. I'll come back to this later on, talking about what that meant. But self-awareness is kind of the last stage. If you look at the technology timeline, hand axes right through to today, where we've got genomics, we've got nanotechnology, we've got cybernetics, we've got biotechnology. I mean, fields that you could spend months talking about what they can do and where we've come from in a staggeringly short amount of time. Staggeringly short in terms of evolutionary terms. It's worrying and amazing, probably at the exact same time. So I presented this to John and I said, look, we're on this journey, and what does it mean? And he threw back at me the Gilgamesh and Enkidu story, one of the oldest stories. I think it originated in Mesopotamia, Sumeria. And the basic story is that the gods create Gilgamesh, the superhuman. They give him all kinds of powers. He's young, he's strong, he's fearsome, he's an incredible warrior. And they put him down onto the planet, and he just starts abusing his gifts. And so the people beg, Anu, I think was the god at the time, they beg to have, some kind of balancing force. So Enkidu, which was a subhuman, was created. And he was connected to the animals and so on, and he was wild and so on. And Gilgamesh hears of him and decides to battle him, and a great fight happens between the subhuman and the superhuman. And I think Enkidu loses, but out of it becomes a great fraternal connection. The two of them become bonded, and they decide, well, together we can do great things. So they go to a place called the Cedar Forest, and they decide to tear it down because it's owned by the gods. But they have to kill this great guardian, Huawa. And they manage to kill the guardian through sleight of hand. But what they discover is that the guardian doesn't die. He dies at that moment, but he spreads himself all throughout existence. So that any time they go and tamper with nature, the guardian is revealed to protect it again. And I think, as far as I remember the story, they die with that knowledge that they've done something awful. Now, this was written thousands and thousands of years ago, and in many ways it captures the final Eureka in the scientific path, which is what we're now going to go on. That's Huawa. You'll see him appearing every now and again in the next couple of slides. But before we do that, go back to another tradition. Does anyone know what this is? This is the last thing that Howard Carter saw before he broke into the tomb of Tutankhamun in the 1927, I think it might have been. And it's the seal of the necropolis. And what the seal of the necropolis is that it was sealed for all eternity. It was sacrosanct. To break this seal, something awful would happen. And it would release all the demons of the underworld. And so, as the pharaoh was buried and began his night journey, was there a herd? There might have been a herd there somewhere as well. But anyway, the seal was to be sealed for all eternity. And of course it was broken many times. I was to give a talk in Rome at one stage. I remember going down to John and he said, tell them about the seal of the necropolis. That's what they've done. So what have they done? One of the equations he hated most was energy is equal to mc squared. Einstein's equation, published in 1907. It's an extraordinary revelation to know that vast amounts of energy are kept in the tiny fragments of what makes us, the atoms. And it's vast because the number c squared, velocity of light squared, is so huge. So you can create enormous amounts of energy by splitting an atom. And it's the energy of the universe, it's the energy of stars, and it's how we power the universe. Should humans be access to that? Highly debatable. You look at where we are today with nuclear weapons and so on. Did we release Huawa when we went down this road? We dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, B-29 bomber, August 6, 1945 at 8:15. I think 100,000 people died. And then we did it again to prove that it worked. Or maybe to see, did we have a better bomb? It's hard to know. The Big Bang Theory basically says that the universe is about 12 to 15 billion years old. By the way, if anyone's uncomfortable with all this, I redeem it. I'm in the darkness at the moment. Right? I'm not going to leave you in despair. Right? So it's about 12 to 15 billion years old. It began as a violent explosion as we understand it, and space-time is a property of the universe. Space and time are very much integrated to one another. And there's only four forces. We started with gravity. Strong nuclear force is what gives that energy at the heart of the atom. The weak nuclear force is kind of the decay in the universe. We have natural decay in everything we are, matter, and electromagnetism, which is pretty much what we power the planet by. So there's the timeline, 13.7 billion years. It was a massive explosion. It wasn't at a point. It happened everywhere. It's one of the hardest things to get around. The universe isn't expanding into anything. It's if you shine a light and wait it for long enough, it will just come back to the point it shone. It's a closed system and everything happens. The Big Bang happened everywhere. And when we say we're expanding relative to one another. So goes out, and then we come to this point here called the dark energy. This is only a very recent, discovery, but if the Big Bang is right, then we should be slowing down, but actually we're accelerating. There's an energy, there's another force there that we can't account for. So science doesn't know everything. We don't know what dark energy is, and it does throw challenges around the Big Bang theory. But if we look at a microscopic scale, and we go down to tiny amounts of time, it's a bit hard now, if the further you go back in time, the smaller the interval we get as we get down to, in terms of what we can understand. And there's an ultimate point where we can't understand anything. It's called the Planck time. Now, where are we at the moment? We're in what's called the hadron epoch. This is the point when matter started to form. You probably heard very recently the big thing that the Higgs boson. We discovered this, the God particle. The God particle is in here. And the reason it's there is that before it, we had matter coming into existence and then vanishing, but nothing was staying around. It was just a total flux. And then we needed something to explain where did hydrogen come from. This is the hadron epoch. This is as far back as we can go. How do we go back there? We've built this thing called the CERN Large Hadron Collider, which gives us the ability to simulate, how do you believe, about a microsecond after the Big Bang. And so we accelerate particles in these huge tunnels, and we smash them off one another, and then we take radioactive photographs to look at the decay and see if we find the particles that we're looking for. There is no greater achievement in humanity than, I would say, the Large Hadron Collider. It blows every engineering achievement on the planet to date out of all proportion. It is an extraordinary machine. The dark side of it is that they didn't know that they created a black hole. And they built it, but they took that chance anyway. Black hole being a thing where we all go in one big bang. And then the third Hawawa, I wonder, is the discovery of DNA. Now, this is positive and negative, I suppose, but the whole idea of inheritance was known for a long time, around the time of the origin of the species and whatnot. Mendel, who was an Augustinian monk, demonstrated, I think he used pea plants at the time to show that you could pass on characteristics. And then in 1953, Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA. It was not long known that there was inheritance capabilities, but no one really understood what it was. And that's it. That's the building blocks of life. It's a double helix. The amazing thing about it is it's the same structure as a growing galaxy. So if anyone tells you we live in a random universe, just tell them there's nothing random with that. There's structure at all levels in the universe. Structure and symmetry and laws. The thing about the double helix is that, and how it works, is that you can take the two coils away, but they only bond in a particular kind of way. So the way cells work is that the helix is separate, but all the information is in either helix, and then they rebuild, and that's how cells are created. But in that string of amino acids is the building blocks of life. The problem is we know that now. All of future medicine, possibly in our lifetime, is going to be based on molecular medicine. So the old way of treating diseases by scourging and burning and purging will all be treated in a molecular way. And it opens up all kinds of amazing possibilities for how medicine will be treated, how disease will be treated, how disorders will be treated. It's quite an incredible domain, the whole genomics domain. The problem is we can manipulate genes, and that opens up the possibility of, well, why don't we make us stronger? Why don't we make us more intelligent? Why don't we improve our physical characteristics? That temptation, Hawawa, in my opinion, rears its head. I don't know whether you noticed the news recently. I wrote this last week, but I said cloning of a human will happen. I should say that cloning of a human has happened. The announcement was made this week. What does that mean in a deeper sense of being human? So the cloning of a human being basically means taking a donor egg, taking DNA from me, you, anybody, putting that into an egg, and then getting that egg to produce you again. That's cloning. They've done it with sheep, they've done it with animals, and they announced a technique this week in Cell magazine that they can do it with adult stem cells. Are we responsible enough to play God? I won't spend too much time on cybernetics. we're in some of the big German institutes, the Fraunhofer Institute, they've been able to grow synapses onto silicon. It's this here. We have a brain cell connected directly to silicon. But we can build things like bionic eyes, prosthetics, and neural interfaces. We can do amazing positive things. But there is this dark side hanging around as well. And then meddling with the mind, the essence of who we are, we can put our minds into worlds that can't be physically created. We can change the sensory experience. It's something that the mind has never experienced in all of evolution. And we wonder what that's going to do to the mind. And they use these experiments militarily, create these engines where you're immersed to see what happens in the mind. So soldiers in environments that are very, very challenging. So let's close the tomb again. Stephen Hawking is one of the four eminent scientists in the world. He has motor neuron disease. And he made this comment once: we are just an advanced breed of monkeys on a minor planet of a very average star, but we can understand the universe. That makes us something very special. And it's funny, many scientists would completely dismiss the possibility of the existence of God. Hawkins doesn't actually. He says, he says that there is structure, it's not a random universe. A lot of people would like to maintain that it is, but it's not a random universe, and that these are, somebody created these laws or whatever. But his view, if you look at the last line in his A Brief History of Time, if we do discover a complete theory, it should in time be understandable in broad principle by everyone, not just a few scientists. Then we shall all, philosophers, scientists, and just ordinary people, be able to take part in the discussion of the question of why it is that we are and the universe exists. If we find the answer to that, it will be the ultimate triumph to human reason, for then we would know the mind of God. And if you could just change one word in that, instead of to know the mind of God or to wonder at the mind of God, you'd have made some progress. So in my opinion, the final Eureka for a scientist, if we discover that God exists through our desire to be God, to control everything, to know everything, and then we require infinite compassion and forgiveness for the destruction we've wreaked to make that discovery. That's a pretty stark statement, but that's what John told me. That's the path you're on, my man, he said. So, here's human history in a slide. We started with a big bang. We went through wonderful enlightenment periods. We raised standing stones to give reverence to the mysterious. We created the wheel and technology took off. And that image here is an image of the internet. We've connected the planet. We've had an internal explosion, connecting all these different things about who we are internally, but I wonder have we lost something in that process. So go back to Nietzsche's discovery. I've discovered to myself that the old human and animal life, indeed the entire prehistory, and past of all sentient being, works on, loves on, hates on, thinks on me. That awful thing he wrote down. And John gave me one of his books before he died and said, don't read this until you're ready. And he was right. It's terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. But he went on. I suddenly woke up in the midst of this dream, but only to the consciousness that I am dreaming and that I must go on dreaming lest I perish. As a somnambulist, someone that struggles with sleep, must go on dreaming lest he fail. He realised that this was a dangerous thing to know, and that it was a dangerous thing to know and a dangerous thing to take on. And I think John realised that. And that became kind of the bedrock, I think, of some of the things that came up from the mystical path. And we're now going to go on that mystical path. So let's go back to the cave paintings, 17,000 years ago, the pit of Lascaux. It often appears in many of his books. He talks about Lascaux and what happened. And there's an image in these caves. They're in Dordogne region, I think, in France. And there's an image where there's the birdman, I think he calls it, I'm trying to remember it, here. And he's lying, he's kind of a bird-like feature, right? And there's a bull with very, very badly injured. And What John interprets this as 17,000 years ago is that we lost our relationship with those around us. All the paintings in the Pit of Lascaux are hunting paintings, and he thought this was an awful moment. We created an us and them relationship between us and the rest of the world. And these images symbolise that breakdown in that relationship. And that's a very big theme, I think, in John's journey, particularly in the Light Journey of the Guy, is that we need to fix that. And we need to go back and do something about that. There's a fundamental healing required there in terms of our relationship with the rest of the planet. And it became more manifest. So after we're conscious, the book Moby Dick, and Ahab goes off and tries to kill the great white whale, and ultimately ends up doomed. It drags him down to the bottom of the sea. And in some sense, that captures our desire to carry on that path, to spear and destroy, go through that relationship that we have with nature. And again, when you read many of John's books, these metaphors and these myths come in, and he writes them almost like their language and their own. And I couldn't realise you have to know some of these, or you know the basics of some of these myths and stories in order to actually take on any of his books at all. And I'm not saying I'm an expert, but I do think it's important to do that. Brendan, for example, has done a wonderful job in helping us read some of this stuff by articulating and expressing what John saw in some of these myths and metaphors. So the we consciousness, this is worth reading out. This is from Night Journey. We, meaning humans and hammerhead sharks and jellyfish, and prawns and ammonites and trilobites and bacillus and virus and ichthyosaur and tyrannosaur and lion and linnet and the hydrogen atom and the horsehead nebula and tornado and blue tit and spruce tree and trout and thunderbird and tiamat and typhon and leviathan and the nightingale Ruth listened to and Keats listened to and the golden bird that scorns the common bird and behemoth. His view was that we had to think of it all. We have to have a relationship with it all. We're very much a part of it. We're not apart from it, we're a part of it. And that we have to have an intrinsic and fundamental relationship with it. And he uses the Minotaur myth. So what happens here? We have a Minos as a king, and he has a deal, I think, with Poseidon, and he asks him to send him a great white bull. And something happens. The Pasiphae, his wife, is convinced to fall in love with the bull, and then there's a mating between the animal and Pasiphae. Daedalus creates this incredible device for that to happen, and the Minotaur is born. And at the start, there's an effort to try and make this work, but after a while they realise that it's just too awful. What has happened is too awful. So they put the Minotaur in the labyrinth underneath the city. And over time what happens is the Minotaur learns to just eat human flesh. And he has a particular fondness for veal, or young human flesh, children. And so in order to save the Minotaur, who's going stronger and stronger, you have to feed him children. And if you don't, he's going to bring down the city. He's going to smash out the labyrinth and bring down the city. And John uses this metaphor regularly, and we used to talk about it. He said that that's the essence of what repression. We've repressed the animal inside us, and it comes out in all kinds of awful ways. It comes out in Auschwitz, it comes out in the thing we did in Iraq, shock and awe. It comes out in some kind of shape or form because it's repressed. And something fundamental has to happen in terms of that relationship. We have to come to terms with that relationship. A little thing about the labyrinth is that the labyrinth is actually quite an unusual thing mathematically. It is already a distortion of space and time. So when you think you're near somebody in the labyrinth, you're actually quite far away. So it's an amazing, clever way of manipulating space and time. And we knew these things at the most fundamental level of manipulation of space and time before Einstein and Tal came along. So repressing the beast, the Minotaur was hidden away in the labyrinth to hide the truth of what happened. It grew stronger and stronger and had to be fed with those we love the most, children, and would bring down the city with an earthquake if it was not sated. So when you look at the beginning of Night Journey to Gaia, you see a couple of the Picasso etchings. These are drawn, I think, in the 1930s by Picasso himself. and they represent a minotaur holding a young child, hand in hand. And John was really struck by these images because he called it the Spiritus Mundi. This is, I think, from Yeats' Second Coming. This is something revealed to all the world, and it's something profound and important. Now, the history behind those etchings apparently was that Picasso was dating a very young girl at the time. Well, I think it might have been representing himself, but it was his way of healing that relationship. John saw something much deeper and much more profound in it. And he said that somewhere in our psyche we're going to befriend the Minotaur. Who that child is, we don't know, but she will lead us hand in hand with the Minotaur, and we will come to terms with the beast within us. And that's critical for our evolution. And if we don't do it, we won't evolve. So where do we begin on this journey? How do we get to that point? One of the things John said to me was that, I don't know whether if you visited his house, he had the great granite stones raised up to point to the sky when he was building the foundations. And he said one of our first instincts when we became conscious was to give reverence to the mysterious. So when we did become aware, one of our spiritual instinct came out, and we started giving reverence to the mysterious. And that path didn't stop. We continued on that path for quite a long time. He talks often about the Egyptian way of dealing with death. He was fascinated with that. If you look at the image on the night journey to Gaia, you'll see someone on the night journey with Horus, the sun god. And what happened in the night journey for the Egyptians is that you went on this journey and you had to pass a series of tests before you finally reached eternal life. And all through Egyptian culture, there was the relationship between nature and ourselves was very evident. The Sphinx being half man, half beast. There was a lot of this animal and human connection between the two, us and them. And John was quite fascinated by that. But the night journey begins really with the Egyptians. Certainly that title comes from the Egyptian night journey. And then he tells of this great dream. I won't do this justice because it's very hard, but he's in London and he goes into a striptease club, capturing some of the things he did when he was younger. And the music kind of dulls, he goes down deeper, and then he ends up in this kind of 18th century park. And he has a fork in his hand, and then it turns into a kind of a savannah, and he really feels he has to dig, so he digs and digs and digs, and he finds himself staring down at this sea, right? And a figure comes out and lifts this grid up from the sea, and then these beasts from the base, he calls them the gridzolas or the benthos, like from the very base are released, and they come to John, and it looks like they're going to engulf him. And he sits there and realises, that's it, I've gone down deep into myself, I'm going to be engulfed, right? And there's a few iterations, and eventually nothing happens, and he ends up staring at an innocuous little creature going about its business. And the way, it was one of these meta dreams, he remembered it so vividly, it was probably a lucid dream, he remembers it so vividly, and the way he interpreted it, for me anyway, was he said, I went down into my psyche, I went down into those deep parts of myself, I discovered what I am, what the awful beast down there, whatever it might be. But they didn't overcome me. I was able to deal with them. There is a way out. There is a way of actually coming to some kind of resolution with the deepest parts of ourselves. And on a broader level, his challenge to us all is that we need to go on a night journey hand in hand with God, facing our primal selves in the process. He would argue that we can't go on a night journey without God. If we do, we'll be overcome. We need a spiritual anchor to help us on that journey. To not do that journey is to not evolve. And not only to not evolve, but to face the possibility of regression, going back into a more primal reptilian state. So the night journey, he believes, was an essential part of the human journey, but it can't be done without God. And in there is the essence of faith. I believe personally, as I've gone on this journey, is that we have a dependency on God. God is an intrinsic part, and we can't separate. And we have to come to that realization. Come to that understanding of ourselves. So he got heavily suppose, into this thing called the Tenebrae ritual, which is the opposite of what you think you need to do. It's a ritual of subtraction, but it's a ritual going into the darkness. So Tenebrae was where you take away more and more, almost doused, you take more and more and more and more away, and you go down there into the darkness. And you stay there, basically, and you deal with God, you deal with whatever is going on. And he wrote the book Slína Fearna, and there's a beautiful line in it, which is, again, is worth reading out. Indeed, given how inwardly precipice we are, as in Pasiphae, Action, Oedipus, all these other myths that he integrated into one kind of understanding, we must be careful, especially on the far side of the tournament. Ask too much of ourselves, and above all, to not be overbold. Do not ask too much of us. Some there are who tell their cost will have learned that every ladder continues gapingly downwards. It's a labyrinth, and for that reason alone, we have need of nothing less than the greatest of rituals, Tenebrae. So it was a ritual of subtraction, a ritual of take away more, everything pretty much, a letting go, a releasing, I suppose, on this Slína Fearna, this journey to truth, and it's an essential part of this night journey. Ephaphata. Following this is the ritual of Ephaphata, which is to be opened, to have open eyes. And he believed that this isn't, we're now more enlightened, or we can see more. There's a terrible consequence to having these open eyes. We see the beauty and mystery and wonder of the world we live in, but we also see the horror. And you can't face that horror again without God. You need God on your side to understand that. You'll see suffering in an entirely different way. And he said, you remember saying to me, it gives meaning to who and what we are. It gives guidance to where we want to go. It gives hope and nourishment for the journey. And it's an essential part of our further and final evolution. He would call this silver branch perception. I keep calling it silver birch perception, but silver branch perception, where you can see more, you can feel more, you can experience more, but it comes at a cost. And if you read that lovely line there, endearing to open our eyes and minds to nature, we will be under no sentimental illusions about it. How could we, given the fantastic infanticide that a stoat, when she finds it, will wreak upon a wren's nest. If you were here last week, Connor talks about the part in Nostos where he saw the lamb, the skinned lamb in the bottom of the river and the home goat and so on. He was a deeply sensitive man, and he saw these things as he looking at nature almost with this wonderful sense of eyes that he had. He found it terrible. This was a turning point for him. He had to go back and find a different way to the world. And he would argue that you can only do that with God. So, near the end of his life, I was standing with him in his house one day, and he was undergoing chemotherapy. And he was putting this comb through his hair, and the hair was falling with that big mad shock of hair, as we all know to have. And he was putting it out the back of his house, and I was asking, what are you doing this for? And he said, well, there's a chaffinch at the back here, and he's making a nest out of my hair. And he said he's preparing the way back to divine ground for me. So I managed to get a photograph of this nest and put it. And that's the nest that appears on the sounds, the DVDs that we put together one evening in Eden that Mary had recorded, and we just put some coverings on it. That story so inspired me that he would notice something that small, that simple, and bring out such richness and such wonder. But that's the story. If you put your hands on the box, it will reveal it. The heat will reveal that picture. It was one small gift he left us in one small story. So here's a quote from which I recorded. You cannot do the night journey without a belief in God. The journey is too much for a mind that serves only itself to take. Nietzsche discovered that at the cost of his own sanity. There is a fundamental dependency on the human mind and God if humans are to evolve at all. We reject this dependency at our peril. I was struggling before you passed right. And all down through the books, you'll see this quote, which is the mystical final of Eureka, in my opinion. I could be wrong here. It's Meister Eckhart. He was a Dominican, 13th century. I think he was originally a heretic, or deemed a heretic anyway. It was only the last couple of 100 years that he was seen in a more gracious light, but it wouldn't surprise me that John would find the heretics interesting. But this is a wonderful quote. Comes the soul into the unclouded light of God, it is transported so far from creaturehood into nothingness that of its own powers it can never return to its agents or its former creaturehood. Once there, God shelters and the soul's nothingness with his uncreated essence, safeguarding its creaturely. This is another line. The soul has dared to become nothing and cannot pass from its own being into nothingness and then back again, losing its own identity in the process, except God safeguarding it. And he really felt that we discovered this in the 13th century and we lost the plot because we know this. And that's why he thinks the planet's enlightened, because we know the way to find Eureka. So that's as far as I've got with John. The hardest part, the bit I'm struggling most with now is this concept of going forward unknowingly and not letting the dualising mind get in the way. This business that you have to let go, you have to follow your deepest instinct, because the mind is the blind. It's not the window. It gets in the way of where we're actually going a lot of the time. And he uses the green chapel, the green knight story as a way of showing that. And there's a scene in the story where the knight has his head, he's decapitated, but he picks up his head and he makes his way home. And John points out that he knew how to get home. We know how to get home. At the deepest part of ourselves, he reckoned we knew how to get home. And we have to tune into that somehow to find our way. So if I'm ever invited back, I might do something on this, and St. John of the Cross, which is certainly where I'd be at now, the stark night of the soul and John's journey there. There seems to be great parallels between what John of the Cross did and where John went. So in a strange kind of way, and on a hopeful note, over the years I've met some extraordinary people. John's in the centre of it here. I've met extraordinary people who've inspired me. I've had great teachers in university. Peter McVerry had a wonderful profound impact to me. I've met people who, on the fringes of life, were able to stand tall and face their adversity. But the human beings are extraordinary, and we have an extraordinary capacity to do good and to do the right thing. So look at young Donald Walsh there that passed away during the week. He was 16. You know, his insights for a 16-year-old about life and treating life and so on. This is in us, and that's there. I'm a real believer that we can move forward positively, and we need more enlightened people to help us along the way. But the more we realise that we have that positiveness and that anchorness, the better. So I'm going to take a bit of a chance. I'm slightly over time, sorry about that. This is 5 minutes long. A little bit of history with this. Going back to Faust and whatnot, I was inspired by Gustav Mahler, who wrote the 8th Symphony, the Symphony of 1000. And he put the second half of Goethe's Faust to the music. If you've never heard the 8th Symphony, a lot of people haven't heard it because it's not recorded very often, because it takes 1,000 people, 2 orchestras and 3 choirs and 8 solos and whatnot. But I have a recording of it here anyway. But what I want you to think about is that he wrote this as a way of celebrating the striving of humanity, and that all human longing in the right light can be creative and positive and loving. And in my opinion, this is probably one of the greatest artistic acts ever done. But anyway, that's not for me to say. So I'm going to play this and then